I went to a physics conference and I pointed out problems with relativity. I pointed out 3 problems and really it upset them a bit. And these people that believe in Einstein's relativity, what they do is just make excuses, which is effectively moving the goalposts. You can point out to them that the textbooks on relativity say a certain thing and that's wrong, and they just excuse that as the textbooks being badly written and so forth. So you can't never seem to win with these people. They just want to believe it and they're going to make excuses and move the goalposts. So this video is my conclusion of what I thought after the conference, because I gave my talk, and after the talk they were still arguing with me. And so this is my conclusion. So this talk is called Arguing with People That Believe in Einstein's Relativity, Part 2. I have been to a physics conference and pointed out 3 problems with special relativity. Those there who believed in Einstein's relativity, who I would call the believers, leapt to its defence. I want to go through the 3 problems I presented and their responses. The 3 problems were: Lorentz transformation do not reduce to Galilean transformations at low speed, and that's contrary to what is taught. 2, there are relativity physicists now saying there is no relativistic mass, and that's contrary to what is taught as well. And 3, when Einstein speaks of stationary system, it seems that is what others would call ether frame. So you get the information that Lorentz transformations do not reduce to Galilean transformations at low speeds from this paper. It's called 2 Myths About Special Relativity by a person called Rolf. The problem is time. The Lorentz transformation has this equation for time, and the Galilean transformation for time is t prime is equal to t. And I'm just going to assume these equations are familiar to everyone. The problem is with the Lorentz transformation for time. For low speed, the gamma factor approximately equals 1, and so t prime approximately equals to t minus vx divided by c squared. And the trick being used to think as v tends to 0, then the term vx divided by c squared tends to 0, and so you end up with just t, and that then gives you the Galilean transformation for time, and that's what was being taught. But that's not what happens, because as v tends to 0 can make x of the x divided by c squared arbitrarily large. So what's being taught is false, and the term does not disappear. If you disagree with this maths, then you need to read Rolf's paper, because he's pointing out what we've been taught is false. I think those in the audience eventually agreed with what was being said by Rolf and dismissed it as special relativity being badly taught, and that special relativity was right regardless. That, in my view, is moving the goalpost, and by moving goalpost you mean an informal fallacy in which evidence presented in response to a specific claim is dismissed and some other, often greater evidence is demanded. that is, after an attempt has been made to score a goal, the goalposts are moved to exclude the attempt. I pointed out that what's being taught was false, and now they wanted to claim that was not really relativity. And it's worth noting, as you go into the other responses, I shall point out that it's all moving goalposts as well. So what's being taught is false. You point out to them what's being taught is false, and that doesn't stop them believing relativity. They just decide to believe the textbooks are not explaining themselves properly, and that is moving the goalposts. On the second issue of relativistic mass, there are relativity physicists now saying there's no relativistic mass, and this was pointed out in David de Hilse's film, which is called Einstein Wrong. But physicists like Don Lincoln are now saying there is no relativistic mass, and that is contrary to what is taught to physics students, and the video clip I showed was from that video link. Pointing out that relativistic mass is being taught, but there are people saying there's no relativistic mass, caused the believers to stop arguing against me and instead argue among themselves. I think some believed in relativistic mass and others didn't believe in relativistic mass, and lots of other variations. I think after they stopped arguing among themselves, the decision was that whether relativistic mass existed or not, it was still relativity, special relativity. However, I'm not fully sure what their decision was, and that, as far as I'm concerned, is more goalpost moving. Certain things are said about special relativity, and the believers then want to change things and say something else, and still pretend after the changes that it is still relativity. The third problem with special relativity was based on my talk to the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society, and thing to note is ether can be spelt two ways, and where I was pointing out that with a bit of manipulation in the math that Einstein presented in his 1905 special relativity paper could end up with what seemed an ether frame, and that seemed contrary to what Einstein said about getting rid of ether in that paper. I went on to point out that when Einstein talked to a stationary frame in his 1905 special relativity paper, that just seemed to be a renaming of the ether frame, i.e. Einstein didn't really seem to get rid of the ether, he just changed its name, and that's also something not taught. And the believers, I think, just dismissed that as philosophical interpretation. I think their point of view was that you can interpret things in different ways, so they're just dismissing that. The believers then went on to point out that GPS could not work unless Einstein's relativity was correct. I then pointed out about the GPS engineer Von Hatz, who's well known to us at Japan Natural Philosophy Society, and he disagrees with what they're saying about that. Finally, the believers said that Einstein's relativity was correct because all experiments agree with it, thus implying on me an onus to give an experiment to disprove Einstein's relativity. In my view, that was a deliberate misunderstanding of my talk. I was pointing out that what was being taught about special relativity was false, and I gave 3 examples, and their method of then claiming special relativity was something other than that was taught was bogus. It was flawed thinking on their part and the fallacy of moving goalposts. Showing the theory as taught is wrong then should mean they need a different theory, but they don't seem to accept that, and all they do is move goalposts. As we dissidents kick the ball and attempt to score a goal which represents a goal against Einstein's relativity, showing it's wrong, what they do is move the goalposts, which represents they keep changing what the theory is supposed to be and pretend it's something else. So I've worked out the following flow chart to explain what is happening. Going through the steps now to build this flow chart. So what that happens is the experimenters say experiments support special relativity, and there is of course arguing over the experiments, but eventually the experiments which they say support special relativity are the ones they sort of accept, and those that seem to lead special relativity as being wrong they sort of tend to ignore or suppress. Now what experimenters say special relativity is, I'm going to call SR star, and the reason why it's called SR star will become more apparent later on. So experimenters say experiments support SR star. However, these experimenters don't go into sufficient detail to explain SR star, so that creates the next step in the flowchart. It raises the question, what is special relativity, i.e. SR? So then we have to look for who is going to tell us what special relativity is, which is going to be the physics education system, the educators. So as you go down, we've raised the question of what is special relativity. The educators teach special relativity. Well, that's what they claim, but I'm going to label what educators teach as SR star star. So that's our flow chart. Experimenters say experiments support SR star. Raise your question, what is special relativity? Educators teach SR star star. And the reason why educators teach SR star star instead of SR star is because educators make false claims that are unsupported by experiments. The educator will say their claims are supported by experiments, but that will most of the time just be a false claim. So what they're teaching is SR star star. And SR star star is not the same as SR star, i.e. what the experimenters think is special relativity is not the same as what the education establishment think it is. SR star star and SR star are not the same thing. That means at the step in the flowchart where the question is raised, what is special relativity, there has been a communication breakdown, and that's between the experimenters and the educators. That allows the believers in special relativity to keep moving the goalpost. No goal against Einstein's relativity will be allowed because the goalpost will be forever moved out of the way of the ball by the method that the physics community has set up, namely the method of communication breakdown between experimenters and educators. And that's the end of this little talk, and that's my conclusion from when I gave a talk to believers in special relativity and general relativity. What they do is form excuses so that they can move the goalposts. They don't accept what is being told to them about myths and misconceptions being taught in special relativity. They just pretend that special relativity is something else when things like that are pointed out to them.
I'd like to make a brief comment first, and that is Roger's certainly right about moving the goalposts. I've also experienced something related to that, where there are two goals, and after somebody puts the ball into one goal, they're saying that's not the right goal, and they shift. But you never know what is the right goal until after you've put it into the wrong, what's declared as the wrong goal.
Well, I think pretty much anybody who questions relativity knows about this. I mean, I've experienced it. I mean, when I wrote my first paper on relativity, that's one of the first things I point out is what exactly did Einstein say? What is relativity? But I have a different question for Roger. Roger, how did you get involved with this conference? Who organized it? And what was the purpose of the conference, and what were the level of the people attending? I mean, were they just high school teachers, or were they physics professors, or were they practicing physicists? Can you tell us about this conference and who the people were?
Yeah, this is Dorcas. I go to a lot of conferences on lots of different things, science, physics, and mathematics, and so forth. So, but I've had a big gap at the moment because of the COVID pandemic, which has been quite annoying. So this one I went to is which I found was the Alternative Natural Philosophy Association, ANPA. And sometimes the people who say that Einstein's relativity is wrong end up there. But it is sort of like an open group where they allow people with different points of view, but you've got to
So these were not professional mainstream carrying physicists.
They were professionals. They allow professionals go in, and that was mainly what they were. Sometimes they have interested laymen who don't normally allowed to give a talk. You've got to get sort of like special permission to be able to give a talk. So I managed to get through somehow. But there's been various people over the years that have said Einstein's relativity is wrong in that group.
Okay, let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
Were any of the people in the audience stand up and say, I'm an expert on Einstein's theory of relativity. I teach it in school, and give an answer to the issues that you raised. You didn't have anybody like that, right?
You had. I got a professor who's retired from physics, so he's supposed to be an expert in it. And then there's one person who was the main one attacking me. He said he had done experiments on relativity and found it's true, and he's written scientific papers on it and so forth. So, and there was another person, I didn't get the full details of where his background was, and he was saying, oh, I've only got hay fever, and it turned out in the end he had COVID.
Okay, so my question is,
so I wasn't able to interrogate him as much as I could the other person, but basically,
based on what you've said in your talk, I got the impression from what you said that these people really didn't know what they were talking about. They just knew that relativity was right because they were told it was so by somebody, or they were taught it in school, and they didn't really understand any of the issues that you were raising, and so they
were professionals.
But that doesn't mean they understand anything about Einstein's SR.
Well, they claim that they do.
Yeah, well, there's the problem, okay?
And they got PhDs and all that. Some of them were on the Zoom, and
Okay.
they weren't all
So-
there at the meeting. So
here's my reaction. As soon as you said that they started arguing amongst themselves, that's a tip-off that they don't really know what the answer is. And I think that's what the issue is. It's when you're dealing with a theory that somebody says is correct, Einstein's relativity is correct. These people don't know enough about it to know whether what you're saying is right or wrong. So what is their reaction going to be?
I think you're talking about the second problem about relativistic mass, and that's where they argued among themselves.
Right.
What ends up is they have their own particular personal theories. They have their own pet theories, and they think their pet theories are tied into Einstein's relativity. So they weren't agreeing among themselves about their own personal pet theories, and they weren't agreeing as to what special relativity was on that issue of relativistic mass. One person was saying that Don Lincoln was wrong. It's mainly Don Lincoln, who's a physicist. I forget where he's from, but
SLAC.
Sorry? He does a lot of
Stanford Linear Accelerator.
So that the conservativity is wrong. The second principle of thermodynamics is wrong.
Thank you.
I'd like to get back to the question that I was asking before, and that is I'm trying to ascertain what exactly did these people in this conference know about special relativity? Do they actually understand the theory so that they could say that Roger was wrong? Do they actually know what they were talking about? Are they moving the goalpost, or are they just basically confessing their ignorance? That's my question. Is this moving the goalpost, or is it a question of the goalposts don't really have a location to begin with?
Well, the people who get degrees in physics, and so that they were up to that level of at least bachelor's degrees in physics, and the people that you get the general background taught with them, they did know a great deal about physics. And so, as I explained, one was a professor of physics, and another one had done experiments on physics, and lots of them were PhDs. So they believe they understood relativity, and they were defending.
But that doesn't mean that they do understand it. That's my point. My point is this a case of moving the goalposts, or is this just a case of there aren't any goalposts to begin with?
Well, I might say something on that. I was corresponding with a physicist from Princeton. He's emeritus professor of physics from Princeton, William Happer, who he and his team created a type of laser called the spin pump laser, which speeds up the angular velocity of electrons. And then when they come back down again, they emit light, laser light. And I thought, now, and furthermore, this is a man who has stood up to the people who, climate change and so on. He actually said that when I went to a climate change meeting, I found most of the people that supported were on Al Gore's payroll. I couldn't believe it. So I thought, here's a man who I can talk to. I said, I put him on the list for Harry's talk on, for Nick's talk on special relativity. And he came back with how Nick was pompous, and so I said, well, and he said, I've done all these experiments, and every time special relativity has turned out to be correct, And I sent him back saying, well, Richard Feynman said that relativity, that no theory is correct because it's you've done a million experiments and it's always turned out right. If there's one experiment that shows that it's wrong, it's wrong. And I never got a reply. I think he thought, now here is an idiot, and yet here was a man who, as I say, had stood up to the climate change people, and who had developed a new type of laser. So he isn't just a talker, he's a doer. But as far as he's concerned, SRT is correct because all the accelerated experiments ever done with it, it proved it correct, and that's it.
Yeah, you find with people that they've got their own personal point of view on relativity, and so that's what they're defending. So their personal understanding is what they defend, and so it can end up they all start arguing among themselves when it turns out that they have different points of view. But what you got as the dogma, the mainstream, is that there's no experiment that has disproved special relativity.
Could I, Denny, perhaps make a general point and a specific point? So the general point is on the thesis of today's talk. And whilst it's very annoying to come across this changing goalposts and changing arguments and all that sort of thing, I would maintain that it's nothing specific to special relativity. It exists in all avenues of life, whether learned or just ordinary information. Once people get it into their heads that something is right, and that it's accepted generally, well, they'll argue in any way. It could be politics, it could be religion, it could be beliefs in how things are ordered, philosophy, whatever. So with respect, making a big song and dance about SRT is neither here nor there, because you could say the same about any accepted theory. The problem we have is actually more fundamental. It's how come that SRT has been accepted as dogma, unquestioning dogma? Because once it has been accepted, I think you're going to find what you're talking about, Roger, and that's an unfortunate circumstance of human psychology. The more specific point, I'll be very brief, is just a bit of a teaser. It's about Nick's point. And, whilst Lorentz ether theory does obviate a number of difficulties with SRT and paradoxes, I'll be talking probably next week, attacking the Lorentz transforms in all senses, actually, even using a Lorentz ether theory. So I think that they're fundamentally not totally correct.
What problem? What was the problem that Lorentz wanted to solve? Right? It was the lack of invariance of the of Maxwell's equations. But Maxwell's equations themselves are not complete. The divergence of both inductions of electric wave is missing. If you put it as that guy Pepys, it was Pepys, right, long ago, showed, you then get the Galilean invariance, So
you're possibly stealing my thunder, by the way, for next week. My more fundamental point is about the specificity of the annoyance, irksomeness, as Harry might call it, of the special theory of relativity. I mean, it's very pronounced, but it's nothing singular. It exists in all avenues of life. And if you get some sort of theory which for good or for ill has been accepted, you're going to find that people behave like this.
Okay, I don't see how.
Can we given what Roger has said today and presentations by Ian, Nick, and Harry in the recent past on SR, is there any principle of SR which is still credible and stands, or is it just completely wiped off the map? So I'd like to know if among the experts here, is there anything in SR which holds water? Anything at all?
It led us to see Lorentz invariance. For example, in the twin paradox, special relativity holds that all observers' views are equally valid, and therefore you can't say anything about the physics between the start and the end. However, regardless of what home frame is, the stay-at-home frame is chosen, the total net proper time difference is invariant. And I don't think we would have stumbled on that without special relativity coming along.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can we get
my,
back?
my own view may be somewhat different, actually, in this sense that I actually accept. Here's a surprise, might shock everyone now. I accept the two postulates of the 1905 paper in the way they're written in the 1905 paper. Now, the problem is not so much that they've been misinterpreted by people or by academics. They have been extrapolated. So take the second one first, because that's simple. The speed of electromagnetic.
You mean move goalposts?
The speed of electromagnetic, yes, you could call it moving goalposts. The speed of electromagnetic radiation is independent of the speeds of the source. That's actually correct. So what? It's true of water waves. It's true of acoustic waves. That is true. Okay. Now, yeah. Okay. I'm just answering the question. Now the first postulate is a bit like Newton's first law. Newton's first law says an object will continue in its state unless it doesn't. So in other words, in an ideal world where you have no friction or no atmosphere, an object will continue in its state. But in practice, you have a medium there which will restrain it. Now, the same thing, he says, well, it's impossible to detect unaccelerated transitory motion through space. Well, it is impossible unless you have a frame of reference. Now, that frame of reference might be a medium. So in an ideal world, Einstein's first postulate is probably true. And the second postulate is generally true as well for all wave motion. However, what has been said is that all observers are of equal status, as Nick was basically saying. And therefore, the observer should have the same status as the source. And therefore, the speed of light should be independent of the motion of the observer. Now, that is absurd. It is quite absurd. So from fairly innocuous postulates, a complete absurdity has arisen. That's my contention.
He doesn't really go into sufficient detail to explain that. It's sort of that absurdity, sort of like it's out there subject to a lot of moving the goalposts again. On this issue of moving goalposts, we get back to it. I have pointed out in other videos that science does move goalposts in other areas. In the moment they are moving the goalpost on the Big Bang Theory, and I think it's to do with the James Webb telescope, and they're deciding that there wasn't an origin to the universe and things like that. They are moving things a bit, and Fauci, when he was talking about COVID, they've moved goalposts on that. They've changed things. But the trouble is with special relativity, they've been doing a lot of these moving goalposts, and it's not been explicitly clear that that's what they've been doing. So people have formed their own personal theories, and they've moved their goalposts in the way they like, and they've got their own personal view of what special relativity is. And that's what I found when I brought up the second issue of relativistic mass, when they started arguing among themselves. Suddenly on that issue, it was conflict with their own personal interpretations of relativity, which is different to other people. And so that is where you're at. And when it comes to the teaching of special relativity, so with my first example, the textbooks have got a lot of things wrong with them, so say, and that sort of thing is hard for them to accept as well. There's just a lot of all this goalpost moving is what is saving relativity, and they just don't want to accept that's what they're doing.
See, I expect this. I'm rather pessimistic, perhaps, but I would go to a conference and I would expect them to move the goalposts. I'd be surprised if they didn't, because they've accepted this as dogma, and they've accepted maybe the instigator or one of the instigators of it as a god. So I know a bit about human psychology, I would say, and therefore I would expect them to do this. I would be surprised if they would be totally rational and say, goodness me, you've raised something about the ring laser gyroscope, as Slobodan said there, and maybe that can't be explained by relativity. No, they twist it around and they say, well, of course, it conforms to relativity. I expect this, but with respect, to me, that is a function of human psychology rather than physicists who know something about special relativity.
Ian, let me just make one minor comment on that. When you mention this occurs in philosophy and history and the arts and fashion, Well, it's kind of expected there, but in science, you're supposed to have math and logic that would constrain this. But I agree with you, it's not a problem of the relativists or what. Not everyone who has their strong belief system will keep to it, whether they're a scientist or not. But I think what's different in the 20th and 21st century is that we have academic physics does not allow outside discussion, or reacts very strongly as a whole to it. There's
active
total
censorship.
exactly what active censorship. Reading about the 19th century, there were groups that had their strongly held belief, but they were allowed to debate, and different theories were allowed to be expressed. Maybe no one was instantly converted, but I see a qualitative difference between that century, where there was a lot of progress made, to what's happened since 1905.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I would just say that you can find censorship in other societies and in other times, maybe the Middle Ages, where if you said the wrong thing about theology, you'd be burnt at the stake. That was an example. And then we got rid of that by the 19th century. And you're quite right, Nick, I think, in viewing this as being quite contrary to the whole spirit of science, and something that has existed from the beginning of the 20th century. And unfortunately, perhaps it's a precursor of what we have in society now. I mean, 50 years ago when I was in college, we had debating societies and we could say whatever we wanted. Now, I'm not talking specifically about science, I'm talking about anything in life. Nowadays, you can't. There's one correct thing. You've had words for it. You're cancelled and you're not allowed to say this and so on. And that's the world we're arriving at. And unfortunately, it is possible to draw some conclusion that maybe it started actually in science first. It started in what should be the most logical pursuit of mankind, and now it's pervasive into all areas of society. Now there's one dogma.
It's getting worse because the foot soldiers who are moving the goalposts, according to Roger and so forth, are controlled and fear for losing their jobs by the powers that be. In other words, there's an active censorship from a very small minority of powerful individuals. And so to dwell upon, the foot soldiers moving, why aren't there more 20 and 30 and 40-year-olds in this group right now? Well, they could lose their job.
Yeah.
Right.
They're funded to do research on what their mentors fund them, tell them to research. So I think it's restrictive a bit on things. And what they're being taught is that relativity is correct. So that they're not allowing people to come in and say relativity is wrong. You've got to build on relativity is correct. And we as a distant group are pointing out there are problems with relativity, and well, the establishment is going to just turn a blind eye to that. They're just going to carry on regardless, moving things the way they want to move things. When I pointed out this, what I really wanted to talk to them about was the moving the goalposts and the things that were taught to in relativity that were wrong. So I was only wanting to concentrate on those 3 examples. But of course, they sort of then move on to saying, well, relativity is correct because the experiments show it's correct. But then that is not what I was dealing with. I was dealing with pointing out things that were being said about relativity are patently wrong and mathematically incorrect. And so there must be a disconnect between the experiments and what the education people are saying about the experiments. So that is a failure in communication. That problem, I think, is also something they just don't want to address, that they cannot communicate properly between their different departments. You've got the experiment people, the theoretical people, you've got the educators, you've got the philosophy people, you've got the history people, and there's just not proper communication between them. And so they just don't want to address things. They just want to live in their little circle of things and carry on, move the goalposts in whatever direction they want, as long as they can keep their jobs.
It was certainly
Roger.
interesting, the distinction you made, Ian, between the educators and the experimentalists, but you didn't deal specifically with how the theoreticians deal with it. You just made the comment now, but my own brief comment would be that the theoreticians basically believe that the experimenters have proved the theory of relativity to be correct, and
Yes.
therefore they believe it. And the experimenters believe that the theoreticians have established it to be unquestionable.
I'm not. I think the theoretical people believe the experiments have shown the theory is correct, and they're then building upon that with their theories such as superstring theory, and it's just going off in weird, moving the goalposts sort of like directions. But the experimental people, a lot of them, they just don't care what the theoretical people say. So there's a sort of like communication breakdown there. You've got a sort of like prejudice with some. I think it was pointed out in David de Hilse's film that when he talked to an experimental physicist, David de Hilse referred to him as a theoretical physicist, and the experimental physicist thought that was an insult. He said, "No, I'm not a theoretical physicist, I'm an experimental physicist." And he thought the theoretical physicists weren't worth anything. It's interesting when you look in the history of things, theoretical physics before Einstein was not really a proper subject. If you were doing physics, you were just an experimental physicist. And it was only with Einstein when he came along with his theorizing, his thought experiments, and he said, "Oh, look, theoretical physics should be a different subject." And that's where the theoretical physics thing took off. Back to Don Lincoln, when he's talking about relativistic mass, he says relativistic mass does not really exist, but they've been teaching to students for a long time that it exists. And he says that's only a pedagogical device. So what you've done is you simplify things for the students to make it easier for them to understand. So relativistic mass was introduced as just as help the students to understand the thing properly, but really when you look at it, it's dumbed down so much that it's not really true. So it's sort of like the students are being taught things that are false because it then makes it easier for them to understand the subject, which is contradiction again in itself. And I've looked at people when they're teaching relativity, and the teacher will say things like, this doesn't make sense about the speed of light being constant and the relativity principle, but you just have to accept it, even though it does not make sense to you. Even physics, there's no reason that nature should make sense to the human mind. You just got to accept it because this is what experiments have shown. So they've managed to twist things around and say, you've got to accept it even though it doesn't make sense.
Well, that's their way of escaping the fact that they've got contradictions.
Yeah.
Their metaphysical assumptions aren't proved out in nature, and so therefore, nature somehow presents itself to us in a peculiar way.
That's their way of getting around Aristotelian logic. When logic, if you try to put things down as a logic, you say this statement is true or this statement is false, but it's not both. But they manage to twist around it and say, well, you've got to accept it even though it doesn't make sense. So they've managed to throw out logic out the window. This is the way that the moving goalposts work. You sort of like, if you're sort of like a person, you've been taught relativity and you've been taught this sort of like dogmatic approach, you're just going to believe it because you're believing what your teacher has taught you, that it's been proven by experiment. So the contradictions and so forth in there, you're just going to say, well, that's only a problem with the human mind not being able to properly deal with nature.
Well, that's kind of their get out of jail card.
Yeah.
You know, Einstein's theory is, you know, the two postulates appear to be contradictory, but they're not really.
Yeah.
But Einstein says that. And so, you know, to me, that's just a big red flag.
Yes. Yeah.
And then he doesn't really ever define what the postulates are.
When you look at the paper, it says these two things are contradictory, but they're not. You expect him to read something which tells you how they're not contradictory.
Correct.
But it's not there. It's not there. It's
Right.
not there. It doesn't. It just doesn't. It ignores the question. And so, like, and when you read Einstein, there's a great number of things he omits saying. It just doesn't go into the detail about lots of things. And so, like, you've got to accept that there's contradictions if you want to believe in it.
Well,
Actually,
yeah,
I kind of, that was one of his strengths, that he was able to dispel our common sense notions of time and space.
Yeah, I think that was the big mistake there, was it became so mystical and metaphysical that people who didn't understand it were led to believe it was because they didn't know enough.
Because
and
he was
so much smarter than them.
Yeah,
But
because
in reality, they were probably right in disbelieving him.
A lot
So
of
the
people,
paradoxes make it even stronger in
Right.
belief of the general populace.
a lot of people like mystical thinking, and so it really appealed to them, and they like it from that. But if you're thinking in terms of dismissing common sense, that's one of the things they tell you to do: dismiss common sense and accept relativity. And really, what you're doing by dismissing common sense is you're throwing out logic. And so I said, you throw out common sense, you throw out logic, and you just got to accept that nature does not make sense to you. So
I'd like to talk a little bit about what I think is interesting about your experience is, and I'm not really surprised, but one of the issues that I think, the problem is there really isn't a theory that, there's really no theory, we dissidents really don't have a theory that really can replace special relativity other than Lorentz theory, which they don't want to really accept at all. And dissidents really can't agree amongst themselves. Now, there's also the other issue that there are a lot of theories out there. It's just a big morass of confusion. You know, I was reading Solari's papers, and you know, and it turns out that, you know, you can, there's an infinite number of theories of space-time that are consistent with certain systems of synchronization, et cetera, et cetera. And you read this stuff page after page, you know, equation after equation, it just goes on and on and on. And you go, I don't really want to read all this stuff. I want to know what the answer is, but they don't know what the answer is. That's the problem. And they've just grabbed a hold of this Einstein theory as the answer. And whatever the experiments show, they have to show that Einstein's theory is proved correct, because they're holding on to this theory and won't let go of it. That's the only thing they've got to hold on to. That's the problem. That's the real issue.
Yeah, one of the things they say is that special relativity is better than Lorentz theory because it simplifies things, makes it simpler to discard the ether. And they say that's the reason we chose special relativity. But on my third issue, I was pointing out, well, you can still interpret in the mass that the ether is there. And they didn't really want to do anything other than dismiss it as philosophical.
Well, you know, when you're confronted with a new idea that completely goes over your head, what are you going to do? Say, oh, I'm ignorant, and therefore, you just hold on to the answer that you have. The answer that you have is relativity is correct. That's But it seems like the main thing they're holding on to is experiments prove relativity, which I don't think is true at all. I don't really see any truth in that.
That's the reason they make these false claims. I mean, I did 3 issues and I was trying to point out they're making 3 false claims. But if they were accepting a claim as they were making as false, they just move the goalposts. And
I understand that, but that's where you get into the problem of it. If you say, well, Einstein's theory isn't really proved by experiments. I personally don't. I think there's a lot of experiments that come.
That's just another false claim. That's another false claim.
Right.
They've got hundreds of false claims they're making, and I was only able to deal with 3. I dealt with 3.
Right.
3.
The big one though is that experiments prove relativity, and I see no experiments that prove relativity. The experiments that they point to, are kind of like the Michelson-Morley experiment, which, relativity was designed based on that theory. So you can't say a theory is an experiment proves a theory when the theory was based on that experiment.
They sometimes move the goalpost on that because Einstein doesn't mention the Michelson-Morley experiment in his 1905 paper.
He does later in his later paper.
Yeah, he does it later, but not in 1905. And so
there's another problem, which most people have never even read.
Yeah.
The other papers. Maybe somebody has read the 1907 paper, but most people don't even know there are other papers. Maybe they've read that book.
The problem I find with him, the problem I find with Einstein on this is sort of like he seems to change his mind.
Well, he doesn't really. He's moved the goalposts all over the place. So
he's moved the goalposts, and
so there are no goalposts to be there. There's no fixed place for the goalposts to begin with.
So he's got his 1905 paper, and later on he seems to say different things, but he's not making it explicitly clear of what changes he's making. So it's sort of like he's moving the goalpost, but it's not really.
Well, he's done that, but this is accepted as I say, and as you said earlier, they cite these experiments which are of doubtful validity. In fact, they might even contradict relativity. But they then come to another thing which is like mystical. They say theoretically, it's such a beautiful theory that it can't be wrong. It's so beautiful. Well, I think it's actually rather messy. I think a lot of the classical physics theories are more beautiful in that sense because they accord with our everyday axiomatic experience. And this one doesn't. It seems to contradict it in many ways.
But that's the theoreticians when they're working on their theories, they're sort of like they're divorced to a large extent from experiment. They've got their theories of special relativity and so forth, which I think are proven by experiments. Then they just go off in their mathematics, and often just sort of like dreamland, and thinking, "Oh, this is so beautiful. The patterns I'm making, and I'm forming these superstring theories." And so they're off just doing the mathematics, thinking, "Oh, it looks so beautiful."
Well, I think that's very true of the sort of post 1905. Theories that you've been, but I think it's not true with regard to classical theoretical physics. I mean, that has been going on for some hundreds of years from Newton onwards. Yeah. And all I'm saying is that accorded more with experience. I mean, if any of the axioms broke what we know actually occurred in nature, they were thrown out. And then a theoretical model was built on top of that. But this is just going into an ivory tower and thinking of the most ridiculous things which contradict our everyday experience and working out a theory on that basis. But I wouldn't damn all of classical physics on that basis because it's a new phenomenon which seemed to arise maybe in the early 20th century.
It started off with Einstein. They thought they've had this person who could just think through physics without actually doing any physical experiments. So he came up with his thought experiments. And then they falsely think, oh, those experiments are then confirmed by actual physical experiments they do. And so that's what they created, their mythology around all of that. And it's very difficult to get out of that. I mean, before that, you would have sort of like gone by observations and then formed your theory. But with Einstein, it's sort of like he dreamt it up. He didn't actually cite an experiment properly of what he was working from. other than talking about a few magnets moving and things, I think, at the beginning of his paper, 1905 paper. So it looks like a theory created by your imagination. And then they go on about, oh, Einstein's brilliant because he's managed to work out the physics of the universe just by using his mind alone, brain alone. So that's genius. And so they've got onto the genius bandwagon. Whereas
and
before,
it's also a mishmash of some earlier work, you know, of Lorentz and of Lorimer and Poincaré and so on.
But Einstein doesn't cite all that stuff. So you're reading him and you're thinking, oh, he's just thought of it all himself through his own imagination. So you've not got the references in his paper telling you where he's getting this information from. So he's kind of like, he's just gone to bed one night, dreamt it all up and wrote it all down. And so this is a new theory, independent of everything that has gone before. You've got all the other people.
Then to boost that what was added, I mean, you pointed out the Minkowski thing where he objected to it originally and then he adopted it into his theory. The same thing happened with the general theory with Hilbert's ideas and all that. In all the tensor analysis, he said, oh, that's making things stupidly complicated. It doesn't need to be. And then he adopted it himself.
He had to have somebody teach him about tensors before he took it on.
That's true.
That was new to him.
So Roger, I'd be interested in if you went to one of these conferences and made a presentation on experiments do not prove relativity is correct, and see what kind of a reaction you get from that. Well,
the problem is with me, I'm more into what's written down. I'm not actually doing experiments myself. I'm going through the paperwork.
So they want you to prove, they want you to produce an experiment that proves that relativity isn't correct. Is that what you're saying? See, it seems to me they're already out there. They're just basically misinterpreted.
They are rejected. The people who've come up with the SOSE.
Well, I don't really see there's an experiment that proves relativity is correct. All they have are experiments that could be interpreted as being consistent with Einstein's theory.
Yeah, but
not in any way a proof of his theory.
Yeah, when they're doing these experiments, they interpret it as supporting relativity. It is just more goalposts moving on their part to make relativity fit with that interpretation.
And so, then, of course, they don't go into the experiments in detail because they say, oh, all of our modern technology is based on the special relativity. It wouldn't work. You wouldn't have mobile phones. You wouldn't be able to send men to the moon. You wouldn't be able to telephone people. You wouldn't have television. It's all based on relativity. That's what they say.
Yeah.
Well, it could be based on relativity, but it could be based on Lorentz relativity or whatever other theory. There could be other theories that are just as...
They've got their moving goalposts to reject Lorentz because I say they think rejection of the ether makes a simpler theory. So it's all just a mess.
Yeah, right. Then people who have Minkowski space-time actually say that that's simpler than Lorentz's theory. Come on,
Minkowski space-time.
I mean, that's so ridiculous. I mean, I can't imagine that did somebody actually say that to you, Roger?
That Minkowski space-time is easier than Lorentz theory. Well, I don't.
Somebody actually said that to you? That four-dimensional space-time is easier to comprehend and understand, right? No, I don't think so.
They're not experts in Lorentz theory; they're experts in relativity, and so Lorentz theory probably was being missed out of what they've been taught about. And so what they know
is a statement based on ignorance. I would have said, if somebody had said that to me, I'd said, oh yeah, right. It's really easy to understand a four-dimensional space-time invariant group. Okay, yeah, and tensor matrices and all that stuff. That's really easy to understand, right? I don't think so.
I just seem sarcastic, really. That's
absurd.
But some people just like mathematics, and so they just do the mathematics for that and say, "Oh, that's beautiful mathematics." And
well, if you're a mathematician, all mathematics is beautiful, and you just sort of wrap your arms around it. That's one of the problems with mathematicians and physicists, is that mathematicians can make a beautiful theory for anything in physics. That doesn't necessarily mean that it reflects reality.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much, in my opinion, what Minkowski did. You know, oh,
Yeah.
let's have a four-dimensional space-time rotation group.
Well, Minkowski,
No, I don't think so.
well, Minkowski was saying it wasn't Einstein's relativity when he presented it. So it was only Einstein who sort of like adopted it. So you've got this moving the goalpost thing again. He
Yeah,
said,
well, that's that you have a different theory that kind of gets in there, you know, and that
so Einstein's theory incorporates Minkowski. So you could look at probably Einstein's theory in its 1905 form and contrast it with Lorentz and start pointing out problems with it. But it's when they shove on the Minkowski stuff that it sort of like fixes those problems. Just
Well,
that might be, you know, another way of expressing it. Whereas a more pronounced example might be in the 19th century, you had two geometries which were developed on either side of Euclidean. You have Lobachevskian geometry and Riemannian geometry. You know, one is the angles of a triangle is greater than 180, others less. So Riemannian geometry is out there, and it's a great tool. And they adopt it. And they say, well, that the world is of that nature. It's not Euclidean. It's after the geometry of Riemann.
Yeah, and that all got incorporated into relativity.
Yes, that's
Riemannian
right.
geometry. That's part of one of the, so I say, amazing things that Einstein came up with his theory, and look, the mathematicians have already worked out a lot of the maths which he needs to use for his general relativity. And so that's sort of like,
and hence then, you know, I should have, you know, would have been nice if Nature hadn't paywalled these papers of Dingle. And he wrote about modern Aristotelianism, and that was his big complaint. What we were just talking about was how they made everything mathematical and justified it by relativity. And he said, this is all just a lot of mystical, metaphysical, you know, stuff. It doesn't, you know, it's ridiculous, absurd. It's not real physics. It's not, has no connection to the real world. That was his big criticism. And of course, they hated him for saying that. But I think it was largely correct. That's why they hated him for saying it.
But they sort of like the people, they had about a couple of 3 or 4 people argue against him, didn't they? McCree.
Well, you know, once you come out and you've taken a position anti the establishment, they manage to produce these mediocrities who come out and say that you're an idiot and you don't know what you're talking about. And all they do is just recite the official version of what the theory is and then say that you're wrong because you disagree with the official canonical version of the theory. And that's science. It's sort of like Fauci coming out and saying, I'm the science. Whatever I say is the science.
Yeah, and he's moved the goalpost. But sort of like, that was one of the things I was trying to address. What is the official theory? I mean, I pointed out there was things being taught which are wrong, basically. And if those wrong things are being taught as the theory, then the theory is wrong.
Well, their response is, no, you're wrong because the official theory is correct. That's
it's not written down anywhere what the official theory is because they moved the goalpost.
Yeah, we know that. That's lesson number 1 in relativity.
Yeah, they've moved the goalpost. There's no official theory. Where is it written down? What you're supposed to do with the Lorentz transformations in relation to Galilean transformations, because what you got down in the textbooks is wrong. That gives a wrong theory. So what does special relativity really say? And there's, as far as I know, there's nothing written down saying different. So there's no official theory and no official statement of the theory. It's just ambiguous. And being like that, it's a theory where you can move goalposts quite easily.
Well, most of the science theories are like that.
Yeah.
We see that in, as we mentioned before, about Fauci. Fauci is, I am the science. What that meant was whatever today's theory was or whatever result that came out yesterday, that's the science today when he proclaims that it's true. But yeah.
So you have people in official positions. I mean, he represents the consensus of the science in regard to health matters, and he's deification, he's personification of the God. Yeah. And you have exactly the same with the
Einstein.
Yeah, well, he's dead now, so it and so is Hawking. So it devolves upon the later people, you know, to be doing this, or the popularizers. And you have that in all walks of life, unfortunately. And they say that represents the consensus of the expert view. And who are you to contradict it?
With this consensus, though, you're a bully to go along with the people, and if you don't want to go along with those people, then you get kicked out of the group, and then you're not an expert on the subject. You're just a maverick. And so that's how they deal with it. It's sort of like you're bullied to have a consensus.
There are people who deal with this by what they do is they avoid the controversial issues. We had a talk yesterday by a guy works for the National Hurricane Center. And one of the things that he was asked was, you know, how do you deal with people who claim that climate change causes an increase in the number of hurricanes? And, you know, he didn't really give a specific answer, but I got the impression that there are people who have different views, that he pretty much was clear that he didn't believe that this was true. And he's still an employee of the federal government. So apparently in the deep down bowels of science, there's a lot of disagreement, okay, and they can politely disagree with each other. And so that sort of thing goes on. But I think you wouldn't expect him to come out and make a pronouncement, you know, on national television that, you know, climate change does not cause an increase in hurricanes, although all the experts apparently believe that. But nobody's going to come out and make a public statement to that effect.
Well, I think
that's kind of the problem that you have with science.
I think they've learnt now that with the council CANCEL culture out there, that if you say something they don't like, then there's a lot of protesting and you lose your job.
Well, they turn you off from Twitter or something.
Yeah.
And all these big organizations, what are the OSHA, or the whatever you were talking about there, or NASA itself, they have their PR departments and they're all controlled, and they say you're not allowed to speak. It has to be covered by us, and we go through the House agreements and what the chief executive thinks and so on. So it's
what you have is the real science. There are people who are disagreeing violently, apparently, but they're disagreeing privately. They're not disagreeing publicly. That seems to be what the issue is. The issue is you're not allowed to publicly disagree. So at this conference, after this conference happened, maybe a couple of the attendees got together and started arguing with each other about what you'd said, one of your assertions, and they couldn't come to an agreement. But they apparently they did it in the meeting from what you were saying. And
the second issue they didn't agree, is what I can gather. I didn't really.
Right. So they had a disagreement amongst themselves, but even though, you know, they didn't agree on the detail, they all agreed on it. Special relativity is correct. Well, obviously there had to be an answer to this issue about mass increase or not. And if the special theory of relativity was correct, there should be, you know, an answer to that question. And the fact that there wasn't tells me that something's wrong with the theory, because they couldn't come up with an agreeable answer.
In science, sometimes they say, "Oh, scientist, it's good to admit when you don't know the answer," and you're then trying to look for the answer. So you've got dark matter, dark energy, and lots of other things, and they don't really have the answer for it, and they're looking for the answer. And so maybe to a certain extent, the mass is now an unanswered question. They might decide it's something that needs investigating further on down the line to get an answer.
The real issue here is that if you have a well-defined theory, there should be a well-defined answer to this.
Exactly, but there isn't. When I was at the conference, they had loads of books, and I managed to find one book, and they had one by some person, I don't know who it was, and he was reckoning relativistic mass. This is a book back in the 1980s or something, and that was the answer to the dark matter and the dark energy. So you had particles moving around at different speeds, and that suddenly gave you the missing 90% of the universe. So they come up with all these weird things.
Yeah, the real issue, of course, is that they don't. by saying that special relativity is correct and Einstein is absolutely correct and being resistant to that, they're really discouraging inquiry into alternative theories of space-time.
When I'm going back decades now, is when they taught me relativistic maths, I thought the situation was, yeah, you're in special relativity, and in the approximation you're dealing with, you are not dealing with gravity. And so when you're talking about mass, you are only thinking of its inertial effects, and you're not talking about what effect it would have in gravity, its gravitational effects. So you're ignoring gravity in special relativity. You're not talking about, you've got mass, and you're not talking about its gravitational effects. So therefore, as an approximation, it's good when the mass of the object is very low. When it's a very low, when the object moving has very low mass, then you can ignore gravity. And that's why I thought the statement of special relativity was on that issue, because it's that, if you, once again, it's not a case of them explicitly telling you what special relativity is on that particular area, but that was my interpretation of it, that when the mass is small, you can ignore gravity, but when the mass gets bigger, you can't ignore gravity anymore. And so when that was one of my thoughts was, oh, relativistic mass, they can get away with ignoring gravity until it comes too big, and then suddenly you've got to consider gravity. And so my thought on a thing was, if an object goes too fast, then its mass suddenly becomes that of a black hole. And I think Don,
we got about 8 minutes here.
And I think Don Lincoln was objecting to that interpretation of things, because that was my interpretation of it. And I think other people have had that interpretation. And his sort of thing was saying, no, relativistic mass doesn't really exist. It's only a teaching aid. It's something they teach students because they think it makes it easier to understand the subject, but it doesn't really exist. And so this is a doubly goo.
Well, the SLAC people have a linear accelerator. It's a straight shot. The particle goes right down the line.
Right.
The CERN people have a figure 8, and they've got all kinds of weird things like Thomas precession and so on, which, you know, sort of hang together, but it's hard to say that they're true. Whereas if you just have a straight shot down the line, then and you conclude some things, you're on much solider ground, I think. And they conclude there at SLAC, I guess, that there is no relativistic mass gain. It's because they detected at CERN because the particles going in all different directions. Figure 8, I think.
Yeah, but I think it was Butcher's experiment was supposed to be the one that was being cited for the mass to be increased. And that goes back some time ago. I've got to really look into this relativistic mass issue in more detail. I only presented the issue of, there was Don Lincoln was saying this, and he's contradicting what other people have been saying. There's just
that's kind of getting into the weeds of relativity, I think. The real issue is it's kind of poorly defined theory. It's just, you know, anybody can say that it's true by doing an experiment, by interpreting it as loosely as they do.
Yeah. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why it survived so long. I mean, if it were a more defined theory, it could easily be proved incorrect.
I discussed that in my irksomeness paper.
Yeah.
Einstein's predictions are so vague, and you know, he covers all the different possibilities in his predictions.
They do admit Einstein making mistakes, and some like the cosmological constant and things like that, but sort of like they sort of like change things around a bit, because for instance, Einstein said there is no black holes. He didn't believe in black holes, and they've just kind of like changed that around, and now Einstein predicts black holes. So even though he personally believed there's no black holes, in Einstein's theory of general relativity, you've got black holes forming, they say. And so even though he didn't believe in it, his theory shows it. So in one sense he was wrong, in another sense he's right, because his theory is supposed to be right. But you can then dispute that this idea of black holes doesn't really make sense. You've got a singularity with infinite density, which doesn't really make sense, but they want it both ways, really. Even when Einstein gets things wrong, they want to say he's right.
But an interesting thing is that they must be inwardly uncertain, because all of the time they have experiments and they have books and they have papers coming out saying, was Einstein right? God, we're looking, was he right after all? Oh, yes, he was right. Now, we don't have books coming out and articles every day saying, was Newton right? Or was Descartes right? So, you know, if on the one hand they say, yes, it's 99.9% certain that he was right, and yet the papers coming in and say, was he right? We'll do tests on it. Yes, he was right.
Well, they think Newton's been disproved by Einstein. So they've moved from Newton to go to Einstein now. When they say,
well, they do say that in the approximation, Newton is right, you know, at low velocities or something. So I'm not saying if you're restricted to a Newtonian universe, is he right about the second law, or is he right about the law of gravitation? They don't. But things that they say are certain in special relativity, they're testing all the time. There are books by that chap Will, was Einstein right? A whole book on it. He comes to the conclusion that he was, but I don't know if they're trying to prove something. They're trying to obviate their own uncertainty.
He decided Einstein was right, but they're thinking Einstein has disproved Newton, which I think is false, but they think that. And so if there was no Einstein and we're still talking about Newton, we would now be talking about, is Newton right? Is Newton wrong, or is Newton right? If that was the current paradigm and we just had Newtonian physics, people doing.
But we're not saying was Archimedes right about his theories of the levers and so on. And they don't say that was disproved by Einstein. Well, they say in the limit it might have been, but you know, fundamentally they accept it. We don't have papers coming out every day. Was he right?
I don't know. Archimedes, that's going a bit too far back. I mean, sort of like the papers now are arguing about Einstein, not about Newton, because they believe Newton's wrong.
Yeah, but these are fundamentals of our dynamics.
Yeah,
and you know, they become so. So we accept them, and Einstein is also meant to be fundamental, and yet we're questioning it every single day. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah.